Aryna Sabalenka, unshakable, dominant, feared, broke down sobbing. A Philippine billionaire didn't step onto any court. He didn't swing a racket. He simply wrote a number, slid it across a table, and shattered the entire order of women's tennis. $500,000 every single month. For life. Not for Alex Eala, for her parents. Nobody saw it coming. Nobody prepared for what it unleashed. And when Sabalenka found out what that offer truly meant for the future of their rivalry, the tears weren't sadness. They were the sound of a world-class champion realizing the competition just became eternal. This is the story nobody wanted to tell. Until now. Before the cheering crowds, before the viral highlights, before any billionaire ever uttered her family's name, there was a small girl in Manila with a borrowed racket and a dream so enormous it embarrassed everyone around her who didn't believe it. Alexandra Eala didn't arrive in professional tennis on a silver platter. She arrived through sacrifice, layers of it, compounded across years, built on the quiet dignity of two parents who gave everything without ever asking for anything in return. Her father, Michael, an architect who restructured his professional life around her scheduling. Her mother, Ricky, who traveled, managed, organized, and poured herself completely into the logistics of nurturing a champion, without the financial infrastructure that champions in wealthier nations receive simply by existing. This detail matters enormously, because what separates Eala's journey from almost every other elite prospect isn't just talent. It's that she ascended despite a structural disadvantage that would have permanently ended lesser careers. The Philippines doesn't operate with the same tennis federation resources as Spain, the United States, or Russia. There are no automatic pathways, no guaranteed funding pipelines, no government-backed development academies funneling resources into junior prodigies. What existed, instead, was Eala's family, functioning as a one-unit support system, absorbing costs, swallowing uncertainty, trusting a trajectory they couldn't guarantee. She entered the Rafael Nadal Academy in Mallorca, Spain, one of the most elite developmental environments in global tennis. She didn't just survive there, she dominated. She became the first Filipino to win a Grand Slam junior title when she captured the 2022 U.S. Open girls singles crown. A moment so stunning that even seasoned tennis analysts paused, rewound the footage, and asked themselves if they'd misread the scoreboard. They hadn't. Eala was real. Her rise was real, and the pressure her family absorbed to make that rise possible was very, very real. Here's what most casual fans never consider. Behind every extraordinary athlete is an extraordinary financial gamble. Coaching fees, travel expenses, equipment costs, tournament entry, accommodation across multiple continents. For families without institutional backing, every year of pursuing elite tennis is a sustained act of economic courage. The Eala family made that choice, repeatedly, without fanfare, without public recognition. This context becomes essential, because when a Philippine billionaire eventually stepped forward with an offer that would permanently dissolve that financial burden, the announcement didn't just change one family's circumstances, it signaled to the entire sport that a new power structure was emerging, one that didn't require Eala to beg for funding, negotiate sponsorship terms from a position of desperation, or quietly accept unfavorable arrangements simply because alternatives seemed non-existent. Her parents had given everything. Now, somebody with extraordinary resources looked at everything they'd given and decided it deserved a reward. But before that moment arrived, there was a rivalry that had to be lived. There was a champion who had to be confronted. There was a name, spoken in locker rooms, broadcast in stadiums, whispered in fear across the WTA circuit, that Eala would eventually have to walk toward rather than away from. That name was Aryna Sabalenka, and the collision between these two women, one established, one ascending, would set the stage for everything that followed. Aryna Sabalenka. is constructed differently than other tennis players, not just physically, though her serve velocity and baseline aggression place her in a category most opponents never access, but psychologically. She has navigated personal tragedy, public criticism, geopolitical controversy surrounding her Belarusian identity, and the specific cruelty of losing multiple Grand Slam finals before finally converting dominance into titles. She is not fragile. She has earned the right to be considered unbreakable, which is exactly why the whispers about Alex Eala made her pay attention. In professional tennis, champions don't publicly acknowledge threats. It violates the psychological architecture of sustained dominance. Acknowledging an opponent's danger grants them power. Sabalenka, across her career, had mastered the art of visible indifference. She acknowledged opponents enough to respect them, then dismantled them methodically on court. But Eala represented something different, something Sabalenka hadn't encountered quite this way before. It wasn't just Eala's ranking progress, though that trajectory was undeniably steep and accelerating. It wasn't just her baseline consistency or her capacity to absorb pace and redirect it with uncommon precision. It was where Eala came from and what her emergence represented at a macro level. Women's tennis had, for decades, been dominated by players from a relatively narrow set of national pipelines: Russia, Belarus, the United States, Czech Republic, Romania. Exceptional outliers existed, but they were absorbed into existing structures. They trained in European academies. They adapted to established systems. Eala wasn't adapting, she was arriving, with the full cultural weight of an entire nation's sporting hunger behind her, with a fan base whose devotion operated at an intensity that veteran WTA insiders found genuinely startling. Filipino supporters didn't engage with Eala's matches the way tennis fans typically engage. They mobilized. Social media, stadium attendance, organized viewing parties, a collective emotional investment that transformed every Eala match into something resembling a national referendum. Sabalenka noticed. Players at her level notice everything. Behind closed doors, in conversations that only leaked through whispers and secondhand accounts, members of Sabalenka's team began flagging Eala's development with increasing urgency. The serve wasn't the problem. The footwork wasn't the problem. The situation was the problem, because Eala wasn't approaching the top of women's tennis as an individual story. She was approaching it as a movement. And movements, unlike individual opponents, cannot be broken on a single afternoon. When their paths finally crossed, on match courts, in tournament draws, in the shared atmosphere of professional competition, the dynamic between them carried a charge that standard WTA rivalries rarely generate. Sabalenka brought power, experience, and the institutional authority of a proven champion. Eala brought hunger, precision, and the almost dangerous freedom of someone with nothing left to prove to doubters who'd already been proven wrong. Spectators felt it. Broadcasters felt it. The WTA felt it. What nobody fully anticipated was the external force that would intervene in this rivalry. Not another player, not a federation decision, not a controversy generated on a court, but a man. A Philippine businessman whose wealth was so substantial and whose admiration for what Eala represented was so genuine that he decided the time for watching respectfully from the sidelines had permanently expired. He was about to change everything. The name of the individual involved matters less than the magnitude of what he proposed. A prominent Philippine businessman, connected across industries with a fortune built across real estate, telecommunications, and regional financial markets, reportedly approached the Eala family through intermediaries, not with an endorsement arrangement, not with a sponsorship contract contingent on rankings or performance milestones, not with the standard commercial logic that typically governs athlete-sponsor relationships. He proposed something categorically different. $500,000 per month, unconditionally, for life, deposited directly to Alex Eala's parents. Not as payment for anything, not as leverage, not as a mechanism to influence her career decisions or extract promotional value. simply as recognition, as acknowledgement that two people had made an extraordinary sacrifice across many years, and that sacrifice deserved permanent, unconditional reward. The offer, by any reasonable analysis, was unprecedented in Philippine sporting history, possibly unprecedented in the broader history of tennis sponsorship arrangements globally. It didn't follow established commercial templates. It didn't require legal frameworks governing performance triggers or marketing deliverables. It was, in its essence, an act of profound personal generosity from someone who had watched the Eala family's journey with sustained admiration and decided that admiration had a price, and he was willing to pay it indefinitely. When word of this arrangement began circulating, first through Philippine business networks, then through sports media, then across international tennis coverage, the reaction was immediate and polarizing. Some observers celebrated it as exactly the kind of structural investment Philippine sports had always needed. Others questioned the implications, whether unconditional external wealth might alter Eala's motivational architecture, whether removing financial pressure from her family might subtly change the urgency that had powered her ascent. These were legitimate conversations, even if many of the people having them were doing so with barely disguised discomfort at the scale of the gesture. But the reaction that nobody anticipated, the reaction that genuinely stunned the tennis community when details emerged, came from Aryna Sabalenka. Sabalenka, who had built her champion's identity partly on the narrative of self-sufficiency, of fighting through adversity without institutional rescue, of achieving through sheer force of will and preparation, processed the news about Eala's family with a complexity of emotion that her public persona rarely displayed. Sources close to her camp described it carefully. Not jealousy. Sabalenka's financial position as one of the WTA's highest earners made the monetary dimension irrelevant to her personal circumstances. Not resentment of Eala specifically. Their professional relationship carried mutual respect beneath the competitive intensity. What affected Sabalenka was something more profound and less easily articulated. It was the recognition that Eala's support structure had just become permanent, that the financial vulnerability which sometimes creates psychological pressure in athletes from under-resourced backgrounds had been eliminated entirely from Eala's equation, that the competitive landscape had shifted, not on a scoreboard, not through a ranking adjustment, but through a single private financial arrangement between a billionaire and a family who had sacrificed without complaint for years. The champion, who feared nothing on court, sat with this information and felt, for the first time in a very long time, something that resembled genuine uncertainty about the future. And then she cried. Not publicly, initially, but the tears came. And once news of that moment reached the press, everything accelerated dramatically. The tennis community has a peculiar relationship with emotion. Players are celebrated for passion expressed within match contexts, fist pumps, roars, emotional post-victory breakdowns. But vulnerability outside competition, particularly from players positioned as dominant champions, carries a different weight. It becomes news. It becomes narrative. It becomes the center of a conversation that moves far beyond the sport itself. When reports surfaced that Sabalenka had been visibly emotional upon learning the full scope of the Eala arrangement, that she had, in a private setting, cried, the interpretation machine activated immediately. Tennis analysts debated what the tears meant. Social media divided aggressively along predictable lines. Filipino supporters, understandably, treated the news as validation, proof that Eala's trajectory was now so significant that even the sport's reigning power had been moved by its implications. Sabalenka supporters pushed back, arguing that the tears were being mischaracterized, that private emotional moments deserved protection from public speculation, that reducing a champion to a reaction to a rival's fortunes was reductive and unfair. Both positions contained genuine truth. The discourse, as tennis discourse frequently becomes, was more complicated than its most vocal participants were willing to acknowledge. What got somewhat lost in the noise was the more human dimension of Sabalenka's response. Those who knew her well, Coaches, former training partners, individuals whose professional proximity gave them access to who she was beyond the competitive exterior, suggested that her emotion wasn't primarily about Eala at all. It was about what the moment represented in a broader sense, about the recognition that unconditional support, the kind that doesn't expire, doesn't require performance, doesn't come attached to commercial expectations, is something extraordinarily few athletes ever receive. About the specific loneliness of operating at the summit of any elite sport, where the financial structures around you are always conditional, always tied to your continued relevance, always one injury or slump away from renegotiation. The Eala family had just received something permanent, something that acknowledged their sacrifice without asking for future demonstration of worth. And in the quiet of a private moment, Aryna Sabalenka, a champion who had achieved everything professional tennis could offer, apparently felt the weight of that contrast acutely. This is not a small thing to acknowledge. Champions are human. The relentless performance of invulnerability is exhausting, and sometimes, even briefly, the architecture holding that performance together reveals its seams. Meanwhile, the broader narrative around Eala's career shifted perceptibly. The offer wasn't just financial news, it functioned as a public statement that the Philippines was serious about its champion in a way that institutional frameworks hadn't yet fully demonstrated. Private capital was doing what federation structures had not. A single individual's generosity was communicating something about national pride that no official statement could have replicated. Eala herself, navigating all of this with the characteristic composure that had become one of her defining professional traits, remained focused on competition. She understood, perhaps better than most of the commentators generating heat around her name, that the most meaningful response to any external development was continued performance on court. But the landscape had permanently shifted, and the rivalry with Sabalenka had acquired an entirely new emotional dimension, one that neither player had anticipated and neither could simply ignore. When the dust settles and the commentary quiets, what does this moment actually mean for the future of women's tennis? The answer is more complex than anyone is willing to say directly. Strip away the drama. Remove the social media noise, the polarized commentary, the competing narratives each side preferred to believe. What remains when you examine the situation with clear eyes? A family sacrificed enormously for a generational talent. A private individual recognized that sacrifice and chose to reward it permanently. A champion processed the implications of that arrangement and experienced a very human emotional response, and an entire sport found itself confronted with questions it doesn't typically ask openly. Who funds the next generation of elite tennis? What obligations exist, financial, structural, institutional, to families who make the sacrifices required to produce champions? And what happens to the internal psychological landscape of professional competition when external wealth eliminates variables that previously functioned as pressure points? These aren't comfortable questions for governing bodies of professional tennis. They reveal structural inadequacies that organizations prefer not to examine publicly. The WTA, the ITF, national federations, they operate with systems designed for a different era of sports economics, one where the financial burden of elite development fell almost entirely on families or wealthy individual patrons, while institutions claimed credit for the champions those sacrifices produced. The Eala situation and the extraordinary private intervention that made international headlines illuminated this structural reality with uncomfortable clarity. And Sabalenka's response, whatever its precise emotional content, reflected something every elite athlete understands privately. The conditions surrounding competition are never entirely fair. The players who reach the top do so through combinations of talent, sacrifice, circumstance, and, frequently, the presence or absence of financial support that has nothing to do with merit and everything to do with accident of origin. Eala's family had just had their circumstantial disadvantage permanently corrected by someone with the resources to do so, and the tennis world had to decide what it thought about that. Some concluded it was beautiful, a story of recognition and reward that the sport's official structures had failed to provide. Others worried about precedent, about the implications of private billionaire intervention becoming normalized within professional sports ecosystems. Both perspectives deserved serious engagement rather than reflexive dismissal. What nobody seriously disputed was the impact on Alex Eala herself. She had spent her entire career developing within a context of financial uncertainty, not desperation, but the sustained awareness that resources were limited and every decision carried weight. That context, whether consciously or not, had shaped her competitive identity, had contributed to the hunger, the focus, the refusal to waste opportunities that characterized her best performances. The question that genuinely fascinated the tennis analysts paying closest attention wasn't whether the financial arrangement would corrupt Eala's drive. Champions of her psychological composition don't work that way. The real question was whether freedom, genuine, unconditional, permanent freedom from financial anxiety for the people she loved most, might actually expand what she was capable of. Whether the removal of background pressure might allow a fuller expression of talent that constraint, however motivating, had kept partially contained. The evidence from comparable situations in other sports suggested the answer was yes, profoundly yes. And that prospect, more than any rivalry, any tearful champion, any headline, was what the Philippine tennis community found genuinely electric. History doesn't move in straight lines. The moments that define eras rarely announce themselves with clear labels. They embed themselves in sequences of events that only acquire their full meaning in retrospect, when someone looks backward and says, "That was the moment everything changed." The announcement of a Philippine billionaire's extraordinary commitment to Alex Eala's family may well be one of those moments, not because of the money itself, though the financial scale is genuinely remarkable, but because of what the money represents within a larger narrative about where global tennis is heading and who gets to write its next chapter. For decades, women's tennis excellence flowed from specific geographic pipelines: Eastern Europe, the United States, Western Europe. These weren't accidents. They were the products of sustained infrastructure investment, deep coaching ecosystems, and the accumulated cultural weight of nations that had prioritized tennis development across generations. The emergence of genuine, sustained excellence from Southeast Asia represents something structurally different. It requires individual talent of the highest order, which Eala possesses undeniably, but it also requires the scaffolding to support that talent across the years required to transform potential into sustained elite performance. That scaffolding, in the absence of institutional equivalents, now exists for Eala in a form that cannot be revoked. Aryna Sabalenka, processing all of this from the vantage point of a champion who has earned every component of her position, faces a competition that has become categorically different from anything she managed before. Not because Eala's ground strokes changed, not because her serve velocity shifted, but because the human being behind those ground strokes now operates from a foundation of security that resets her psychological landscape entirely. Champions who have competed at the highest level understand something casual observers frequently miss: the mental weight of background anxiety about family stability, about career sustainability, about what happens if one season goes badly, is real, and it costs real cognitive and emotional bandwidth. Bandwidth that, once freed, becomes available for competition itself. Sabalenka's tears, in this light, weren't weakness, they were wisdom, the recognition of someone who has competed long enough to understand the variables that determine outcomes at the margins, the spaces where championships are won and lost, not by the gap in talent, but by the gap in everything surrounding talent. She saw what the offer meant. She understood its implications for the trajectory of a rivalry that had captured the attention of women's tennis globally. And she felt it. Fully, honestly, humanly felt it. The story of Alex Eala and Aryna Sabalenka is far from finished. In many ways, the most significant chapters haven't been written yet. Courts will be played on, points will be contested, championships will be decided in tight third sets under enormous pressure. But the conditions under which that competition unfolds shifted permanently the day a Philippine billionaire decided that recognizing extraordinary sacrifice was worth $500,000 a month, indefinitely. Was this a rivalry, or the beginning of something that will reshape an entire sport's geography of excellence? Leave your answer below, because this conversation is only starting. Alex Eala didn't just gain a financial safety net, she gained freedom. Aryna Sabalenka didn't just cry, she acknowledged, in the most human way possible, that the competition ahead would be unlike anything behind her. And women's tennis, whether it recognizes it or not, just entered a new chapter. If you stayed through this entire story, you already understand why this matters. Subscribe now, because the next chapter of this rivalry arrives faster than anyone expects, and you need to be here when it does. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications. This is only the beginning.